Hello and welcome! Let's say you are a video game developer / publisher who has noticed the recent rise in video game remakes, with classic titles once more adorning the store shelves like it was the late 90s. So to capitalize on the situation and to make a solid profit, you, as a video game developer / publisher, decide to make your own video game remake. A classic idea. But how do you do this, and to make yours better than the rest? Well, fortunately, this isn't the first time in history that video games have been remade. And today I'm going to show you a few older titles to explain what I think you'll need to do and not to do to make not just a good remake, but the best remake. Today's video is sponsored by us at 16-Bit Games. 16-Bit Games has a variety of mobile games available on Android and iOS. They're fun, fast action games designed with mobile devices in mind, which means they all look, play, and control well, no matter what device you have. Play them today for free from the links in the description below. Now, the reason we have video game remakes from the past is because back then, video game consoles weren't as cohesive as they are today. Each and every game system was unique in its own way, from the hardware to the button layouts to its development environment and more. So much so that if you were to even try to play one game from something that's even within the same line of consoles on another, it just wouldn't work. And as a result, if you are a developer and publisher and you wanted one of your games to be made on a Sega but also work on a Nintendo, you would basically have to remake your game again from scratch. This is the reason why back in the day, the quality of video games, even with the same title, would vary from system to system. And it's from these games we can learn what does and doesn't work when you're remaking a video game, and understand the basic rules you should follow and the understanding that gamers have when you see a video game remake. And what's a better place to start than to see where a remake went wrong? And there is no better example of this than the most defining game for not just the early 1980s, but also for the Atari 2600. And I'm of course talking about Pac-Man. Pac-Man for the Atari 2600 is a notorious game for the system, and for being one of the worst official ports of Pac-Man. But weirdly enough, I find that if you look beyond the poor graphics and the squelching noises, the core of what makes Pac-Man is still here. All you'll need to do is just mute the TV and turn the game to black and white. Your character eats dots. There are ghosts which will chase you around the maze, and if you touch them, they'll kill you. There are power-ups which allows you to eat the ghosts, and the game has a maze with tunnels. Everything from Pac-Man is technically here, and has been remade as faithfully as possible for the Atari 2600. But yet, when we unmute the TV and switch the colors back on, it's obvious this is anything but similar to the original. Which brings us to the first rule, which you'll need to keep in mind while you're developing your remake. Make sure your game, at the bare minimum, resembles, looks, sounds, and feels like the original game, or as I like to call it, the TV commercial test. If you were to make a TV commercial of your game, would the viewing audience recognize it from just sight and sounds alone? And Pac-Man for the Atari 2600 obviously does not pass this test. Even the commercials from the time just showed as little gameplay as possible and didn't even bother including the in-game audio. But weirdly, all it would have taken to get Atari's Pac-Man from being a bad remake to a passable one wouldn't actually take much. Heck, hackers on their free time managed to do this not just with modding the original game, but also taking the requirements for the original game and remaking it from the ground up. Heck, even Atari learned this lesson too with the 2600 version of Ms.Pac-Man. It might not look exactly like the arcade original, but it resembles it enough that it doesn't bring unwanted attention to the changes which needed to be made to ensure that the game worked on the 2600. So, as you're developing the game, making sure that every single blade of grass is in the correct position and the game resembles as best as you can to the original, just keep that original game in mind, because most gamers nowadays can probably get their hands on it relatively easily if they're willing to look for it. Which brings us neatly to the second rule of remaking a game. You shouldn't just be remaking the game as it was. You should be making the game for today. Add new content, change the way it looks, heck, even change the way that it plays if it better suits the system that you are targeting. Find new ways to entice people to play your game rather than going back to the original. Though, be careful with what you add, as the focus of your remake should be to remake the original game, not to adapt the original game into something entirely new. Take, for instance, the Game Gear port of Sonic the Hedgehog. From first glance, the game looks, plays, and sounds just like an 8-bit version of the Genesis game. The enemies in Sonic might be small and appear to be in a different layout than the original, but the game feels faithful to the original game, right up to the moment when you start the second level, when the true intentions of the game are shown. The original Sonic the Hedgehog was a game all about speed and momentum, and when the levels were made, they were designed to keep that speed and momentum going. While Sonic the Hedgehog on the Game Gear is more about platforming and precision. And as a result, the levels and the entire game had to be redesigned from the ground up for the Game Gear. And due to the shift in focus, it changed the core fundamentals of the original game. But because of it, Sonic on the Game Gear crossed a very thin line that turned it from being a remake of the Genesis game to being more of a loose adaptation of it, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, depending on your target system, as it might not even be possible to remake your game in its entirety on it. In Sonic's case, the Game Gear just didn't have the power to keep up with the original game. Heck, it struggles to keep up with the speed which this game already has. So, an adaptation was the best way to get Sonic onto the Game Gear. And it's fun in its own right. It's just not a very good remake. So too much change isn't a good thing for a remake. But not enough change won't entice players to come and play your remake. So what is that good balance between too much and too little change? And I feel a game that does this perfectly is Metroid Zero Mission for the Game Boy Advance. You see, the changes that were made from the original NES Metroid into Zero Missions were changes that felt natural to the game. Lessons learned from years of development and sequel making and fine-tuning which came from the more powerful hardware. And the mentality which I feel this game had was more not really what can we change, and more along the lines of what should have been done with the original game. And as a result, the changes that were added to this game that did entice people to come and play it again were more improvements over the original that fit the games, the atmosphere, and the overall aesthetic which the original game was aiming for. And that's really what you should be aiming for when you're doing these changes. Don't think of going into this that you're remaking the game from the ground up so that you can remake this game. Think of it more along the lines of, I'm remaking this game so that it can be better than what it already is. So, as you're developing your remake and you're trying to make it the best remake that you possibly can, you'll be walking this pretty thin line, where if not enough of the original game is in it, then it's going to turn into a bad remake. But if you don't add new things to it, and you can't figure out that Metroid Zero mission balance of changing enough so that it's enticing people in, but not changing it too much so that it turns into an adaptation like Sonic on the Game Gear, then it's just going to turn into another bad remake. So why bother putting all this time, effort, and energy into this very narrow margin when you might as well just be finding a way to get the original game to work on whatever system you're making it for? And that's actually a solution which a lot of developers lean towards. From Namco to Capcom to even Sega and Nintendo, many companies just try their best to find a way to get their original games to play on newer consoles, no matter cost. And the easiest solution, and the most popular solution, is to emulate the original game on newer hardware. But a more recent trend is with remastering the original game, since a lot of these titles are built on game engines rather than being made directly for the specific hardware. It's just easier to port the game engine to the new hardware and just reuse and update a few textures here and there. It's minor changes and it's a lot quicker and more efficient than using emulation. As a result, these remasters and classic collections with emulations of games are cheaper in most regards, and rather than just trying to remake the game from the ground up again. But what you gain with time, simplicity, and cost, you'll lose in flexibility. When remaking a game from the ground up, you can add in a bunch of new features like levels and graphics and things that would help suit the game with the newer hardware. But when you're using emulation, like in classic collections and emulations, you are restricted for what you can and can't add to the game. It's why DuckTales Remastered has a save system and new levels with updated scores, while DuckTales and the Disney Afternoon Collection only has save states. Remasters, on the other hand, don't have the same issues as emulation, since you have the original source code that you're working with. But a good remaster is the same as a good remake. It also needs to entice players with some changes and improvements to better suit the hardware. Which leads us to the third and final rule to keep in mind as you're developing your remake. Remake only what you can't reuse. Take for instance Uncharted for the PlayStation 3. It didn't need to be remade from the ground up for PlayStation 4, as the original source code and assets could be reused with the Nathan Drake collection, while adding some subtle changes and fixing a few issues here and there to make the game work well on PlayStation 4. But on the flip side, when they remastered Boarderlands 2 for the PlayStation Vita, they were able to reuse the original source code for the game. But it introduced so many new problems that it distracted the users from the experience that the game was trying to tell. And that's the last thing that you want to do with your remake, is make it worse than the game that you're trying to remaster. In Borderlands 2's case, it's obvious that the PlayStation Vita just doesn't have the horsepower to properly port the original Borderlands 2, which is where a remake, or maybe even an adaptation, would have probably benefited the game tremendously, compared to the results that they got instead. So when you do decide to develop/publish your next video game remake, just try to keep these 3 rules in mind. I found this is a common occurrence of a lot of the good remakes that are coming from today. And if you don't follow them, well, there's a chance that you might be bringing unwanted or negative attention to your game. But if you do decide to follow the rules and take your time, put a solid effort into your remake, you might just be able to not just make a good remake, but make a game that gamers will see as the definitive way to play the original game. And you might also be able to use your hard work to revive a long dormant franchise and use the assets that you made to make new games from it. But that's all really depending on what you choose to do and how you choose to remake your game. But that's all I have for you today. Thank you ever so much for watching. Hope you have yourself a good day, and as always, take care. And don't forget about the new poll available every Friday for the 16-bit viewers special. Vote for which games you want to see us review in our community tabs. Links will be provided below.